everyone, it's Kim at Foggy Bonnets, and I'm coming on a little later than normal tonight. I thought I'd try a different time slot for my lives. I know some of my friends in the middle of the country or even out on the West Coast are not always available when I do these, so I'm just trying something a little different tonight. And tonight I am going to talk about using Stampin' Blends. Stampin' Blends are the Stampin' Up! Alcohol markers. I'm going to show you 3 different ways that I use them. But before we get to that, it is a new month. It's December, and that means I have a new host code, and I want to share with you what my host code reward is this month. And it just so happens that my host code reward is a Stampin' Blends combo. Stampin' Blends are sold in pairs now, a dark and a light. They weren't always sold that way, but they are now. And when you use my December host code, it's here too, and on orders that are less than $150, you can earn in the month of December your choice of any Stampin' Blends combo. So I'm excited about tonight. I had someone write to me this past week actually, about using alcohol markers, and really more than technique, I think it's practice. Practice helps make anything better, right? But I do remember when I was new to using alcohol markers, there were some things that I learned along the way that helped me in practicing. The better you practice, the better you are. And I just want to cover 3 principles first that I think will help you. First of all, our alcohol markers obviously have alcohol in them, so when you stamp your image to color, you want to use an ink that is not alcohol based. And the one that's most recommended, especially if you want a black outline, is the Memento Tuxedo Black. This is a dye-based or a water-based ink, so the alcohol markers will not interfere with that ink. The Memento will stay on the paper even when you color over it with the alcohol markers. So that's one. Now you can use any of our classic stamp pads because they are also dye-based, water-based inks. They'll work also, but typically I use a black outline when I'm using the markers. The second principle to keep in mind is that the blending happens when the ink is wet. So I have this scrap paper and I've been playing around with this. If I lay down color with my Stampin' Blend, that color is wet and it's blending as I lay it down. Now if I let this dry for a second, or I'll go up here where it already is dry, and I go back in, you can see that I have a line there because what was already laid down had dried. So if I just go back in and resaturate everything with more ink, it will blend. You see that line blended right in. And the third principle is that adding more ink makes the color darker. You saw that right there. So if I go into this first section that I made here, you can see that it gets darker because we're laying more ink down and we're covering up more of that white paper, so you don't see as much light reflecting back at you. The color gets darker and more intense. So if I go back over this again, it gets darker still. And first principle, just resaturate everything and it'll blend together. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. Now the markers have 2 tips. There's the bold tip, which looks a little like a paintbrush, and it does come to a tip. And this end lays down a lot more ink than the other end, which is kind of a blunt end. Let's see if I can get this on the camera. Where am I? There I am. It's more of a blunt tip. And it comes down to preference, which end you prefer to use. There are times where I like to use the brush tip and times where I like to use the blunt tip, and I'll talk about that as I do the demonstration. So the three ways of using these markers that I'm going to show you tonight are solid color. This is using one blend and just coloring with it. And that's what this is. And then the second technique will be using the dark and the light of the same color. And you can see when you do that, you get a little more variance in the depth of the color. You can get better shadows that way. And then the third technique is using both blends, the dark and the light, and then lifting some color out with one of these. This is the color lifter, and it has alcohol in it, but there's no dye in it. It's just a white tip, and when you run this over ink that you've laid down, you lift out color. So this one, I've done that. So I'm going to show you all three of these techniques. And the first one I'm going to demonstrate is the solid color. These stamps, by the way, are from the poinsettia, how do you say that? Poinsettia Petals stamp set. I've been making a lot of my Christmas cards with this set. It's beautiful. There are all kinds of layering possibilities with the dies. But anyhow, that's where these images came from. And for the first demonstration, where I'm going to use just one blend, I'm going to use the lighter of the two blends. This is the light real red. And the reason I'm going to use the lighter is because, remember the principle, when you add more ink, the color gets darker. So if I start with the light one, I can darken it in places if I want to. So I think I'm going to use the doll tip for this to begin. I'm going to start on the poinsettia. And you want to be careful when you're laying down color that you don't get too close to your stamped image, because the color will bleed a little bit in the cardstock. Oh, and let me talk about the cardstock. I have found that the best cardstock to use to color on is our Whisper White Thick. It has enough clay in it to keep the ink from just absorbing right in. It keeps the ink in play so that you can push it around a little bit and blend it well. And also you want to lay several layers of paper down on your work surface, because the ink will bleed through. In fact, you want it to bleed through. If the back of your paper that you're coloring on doesn't look like this, you're not laying down enough ink. You want it to bleed through. That's the nature of these pens. That's how they work. And remember, the blending happens when the ink is wet. You really want to saturate your paper. So I'm using the doll end, and I'm just going to start coloring here. And I just realized I used a different image for this than what I had used on the cards. So I kind of outline first, and then for this technique where I'm just coloring solid, I just fill in, and then I go to the next section. And I fill in. It's just like coloring, adult coloring, right? And I turn my paper. I always like to have my tip pointing to the left. That's just how I am. So I turn my paper to keep my pen tip oriented that way. So you see I kind of outline, and then I come in and fill in. And I'm not too concerned if I leave little white areas. That's fine. Now if I get to an area where, say, one of these poinsettia leaves comes to a sharp point, I might switch to the bold tip, because remember, it has a nice point on it, and I can get that point up into a narrow area like that. So I'll just show you using this You can see you can lay down a bigger swath of color with the bold tip. It's almost like using a paintbrush, really. So it colors in a little bit quicker because you're covering a bigger area. But again, you want to make sure that you're careful up against your image outline because you don't want the ink to bleed over that line. So that's using just the solid coloring technique. I'll do a little bit of the holly leaf, and this color, I love this color. This is the light mossy meadow, and I'll start with the bold tip for this and just show you. I go around and then just fill in. And you'll see variations in your color. It almost looks like watercolor, and I don't mind that a bit. I just don't want really harsh lines. And if you happen to get a harsh line, you just need to go back in and resaturate the ink, and it'll blend together. So you see how quick that was? And then if I wanted to, I could just add a little bit of shadow down here just by going back over. Remember, this is just one color, but you can add a little bit of depth just using one color. So that's the solid color, and that's what it looks like on a card. All right, so next I'm going to use both blends, the dark and the light, for my next sample. So this will be dark and light. So when I'm using two blends, a dark and a light, the first thing I do is I outline with the darker color. So I'm going to use my blunt end, and I'm just going to outline, and I work a section at a time here. I'm going to outline with the darker red. Oop. Go around, and I'm not worrying about getting right up against that line. I'll maybe do one more petal here. Then I come in with the lighter shade of the same color, and I'm going to start in the dark, resaturate that, and then pull it towards the middle. Now this is with the blunt end, so I'm going to resaturate that and pull it towards the middle. Resaturate where the dark is if it's not still wet, and pull it in towards the middle of my petal. So you can see that you get some variation in the shades by doing that. So I'm going to show you another way I do this. I'll outline one again with the dark. And since this is a bigger area, I might come in with the brush tip, and because it lays down ink a lot quicker, higher volume, I get that saturated and blended a little quicker. And then I might take it and just take that out to the outline, just like that. So you can see some of that shading that happens when you outline in the dark and then pull it into the middle with the lighter. Do one more here. There we go. I will do the green leaf now. I think sometimes the green shows up better on camera. So same principle. I'm just going to outline with my blunt tip. Around this holly leaf with the dark. Just like that. And I might run some dark up a few of these veins in the leaf. Then I'm going to grab, I'll use the brush tip on this because this is a pretty big area. I'll use the brush, oops, wrong end, brush tip, and I'll just go back in, saturate that dark again, and it blends immediately. And pull it down towards the center. So as I saturate that dark that I laid down first, it just starts blending right into the light. See the variation in color? And if I wanted to, I could go back in with the dark and just maybe add a touch more to get a little deeper shading here and there. And where it's still wet, it blended on its own, but if I need to, I can go back in with the light and just blend that in. So simple, it really is. It just takes a little bit of practice. And I do see a line up there. A little bit of practice. And if you need to blend an area, just resaturate it. So finally, I will show you the technique where I lift out some color after I've got it laid down. That's using a light and a dark blend and then lifting highlights with the color lifter. So let's do the leaf for this. I'll start with my dark again, and I think I'll use the blunt tip again first. Just go around my leaf, come up the center. All right, and then come in with the light. And I'm just resaturating where that dark was already laid down, and some of it's dry already. Just like that. Okay, so I have my leaf now, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to come in and I'm going to pull up some highlights with this lifter pen. Actually, at first I'm going to blend a little more here. And there are, honestly, there are some brilliant alcohol marker artists out there. I'm not one of them. I'm good enough to make cards that I like, but I mean, there are some artists out there who make such beautiful pieces of artwork with these pens. But like I said, if you're happy with what you make, then you're good enough, right? All right, so I'm going to take the blunt end of my lifter, and the trick to using this is to not get too heavy with it. You don't want to go over an area too much. It's better maybe to go back in and try it again than to do too much at one time. So I'm just going to come on this leaf just like that, and I'm just going to kind of just scribble lightly on that leaf. And then come back in. There. You see how it pulls up a highlight? And the reason you don't want to stay in one spot and just keep rubbing is because it will kind of cause the ink to almost puddle in a way, and you'll get sort of a harsh line around the outside of your highlight. So you just want to come in lightly and just lightly brush over a couple of times. And you almost won't even see it at first, but as the alcohol begins to dry, you'll see where you've lifted some color. See that? So if I wanted to do a little more here, I'd come back in, but I wouldn't stay there too long because there, I like that. You're just lifting out a little color at a time. You're not going to sit there and rub on it. All right, so I'll do a little section of the poinsettia leaf just to show you how that works, lifting some color out. So I'll do this section. I'm going to just outline with the dark. And then come back in with the light. There we go. I'm going to give that just a second to dry. Maybe I'll color another leaf. That's what I'll do. And you see I stay away from that outline. And then when I go back in, especially if I'm going to use the brush end, I can take that dark color out to the outline when I come back in and fill with the lighter color. Just like that. Okay, so now I'm going to highlight this leaf. It should be dry now. And same thing, I want to just come in and just lightly brush with that. I'm just lifting off a little bit of color. And if it doesn't look like quite enough, then I'll come back in, and you can clean off your tip just by rubbing it on paper. I'll come back in and lift a little more off. Just like that. You see how it adds just a nice little highlight. Okay, so there you have 3 ways that I use markers. I use them just to color solid with one color. I use the dark and the light of the same color to get some shadowing and depth. And finally, I use the dark and the light and lift out some color with the color lifters. So give it a try, practice a little bit, you'll get the hang of it. Remember, adding more ink will make it darker, even if you're only using one color. The ink blends when it's wet, so if you're getting a harsh line between areas, go back in and resaturate and you'll see that it'll blend. And use non-alcohol ink to stamp your image, okay? And Whisper White thick cardstock is what I recommend to stamp on. So enjoy. Let me know if you have any questions, and remember the December host code reward is your choice of a Stampin' Blends combo. I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me.